Hello, it's Susie again, and today I'd like to read to you the second part of Willa Cather's short story that's not too short, Paul's Case. And let's recap what we read in part one. This is a story about a boy named Paul, a high school boy who has been suspended from high school, and it's learned that he was suspended more for the things he's done as much as the things his manner, his way of treating teachers. He's a little smug and strange, but they have let him come back to school. And we also learn that he is very dissatisfied with his middle class surroundings and lifestyle, and he really yearns to be part of a glitzier world that he sees as an usher at Carnegie Hall. And he really feels like his life is transported into a magical world when he's at his job and he sees the actors and the performers and sees them go into these beautiful hotels, and he imagines that one day he might live like that. And he brags to his friends a lot about the people he knows from his job, and he talks big and says one day he's going to these lavish places like Venice and Cairo. And eventually, however, his school decides that he should not continue his studies, and they talk to his father, and it's decided that he will quit school and have to go to work. So that's where we will pick up in part two of Paul's Case. The eastbound train was plowing through a January snowstorm. The dull dawn was beginning to show gray when the engine whistled a mile out of Newark. Paul started up from the seat where he had lain curled in uneasy slumber, rubbed the breath-misted window glass with his hand, and peered out. The snow was whirling in curling eddies above the white-bottomed lands, and the drifts lay already deep in the fields and along the fences, while here and there the long dead grass and dried weed stalks protruded black above it. Light shone from the scattered houses, and a gang of laborers who stood beside the track waved their lanterns. Paul had slept very little, and he felt grimy and uncomfortable. He had made the all-night journey in a day coach, partly because he was ashamed, dressed as he was, to go into a Pullman, and partly because he was afraid of being seen there by some Pittsburgh businessmen who might have noticed him in Denny and Carson's office. When the whistle awoke him, he clutched quickly at his breast pocket, glancing about him with an uncertain smile. But the little clay-bespattered Italians were still sleeping. The slatternly women across the aisle were in open-mouthed oblivion, and even the crummy, crying babies were for the nonce stilled. Paul settled back to struggle with his impatience as best as he could. When he arrived at the Jersey City station, Paul hurried through his breakfast, manifestly ill at ease, and keeping a sharp eye about him. After he reached the 23rd Street station, he consulted a cabman and had himself driven to a men's furnishing establishment that was just opening for the day. He spent upwards of 2 hours there, buying with endless reconsidering and great care. His new street suit he put on in the fitting room. The frock coat and dress clothes he had bundled into the cab with his linen. Then he drove to a hatter's and a shoe house. His next errand was at Tiffany's, where he selected his silver and a new scarf pin. He would not wait to have his silver marked, he said. Lastly, he stopped at a trunk shop on Broadway and had his purchases packed into various traveling bags. It was a little after 1 o'clock when he drove up to the Waldorf, and after settling with the cabman, went into the office. He registered from Washington, said his mother and father had been abroad, and that he had come down to await the arrival of their steamer. He told his story plausibly and had no trouble since he volunteered to pay for them in advance and engaging his rooms a sleeping room, a sitting room, and a bath. Not once, but 100 times, Paul had planned this entry into New York. He had gone over every detail of it with Charlie Edwards, and in his scrapbook at home, there were pages of description about New York hotels, cut from Sunday papers. When he was shown to his sitting room on the 8th floor, he saw at a glance that everything was as it should be. There was but one detail in his mental picture that the place did not realize, so he rang for the bellboy and sent him down for flowers. He moved about nervously until the boy returned, putting away his new linen and fingering it delightedly as he did so. When the flowers came, and he put them hastily into water and then tumbled into a hot bath. Presently he came out of his white bathroom, resplendent in his new silk underwear, and playing with the tassels of his red robe. The snow was whirling so fiercely outside his windows that he could scarcely see across the street. But within, the air was deliciously soft and fragrant. He put the violets and jonquils on the tabouret beside the couch, and threw himself down with a long sigh, covering himself with a Roman blanket. He was thoroughly tired. He had been in such haste, had stood up to such a strain, covered so much ground in the last 24 hours, that he wanted to think how it had all come about. Lulled by the sound of the wind, the warm air, and the cool fragrance of the flowers, he sank into deep, drowsy retrospection. It had been wonderfully simple. When they had shut him out of the theater and concert hall, when they had taken away his bone, the whole thing was virtually determined. The rest was a mere matter of opportunity. The only thing that at all surprised him was his own courage, for he realized well enough that he had always been tormented by fear, a sort of apprehensive dread that, of late years, as the meshes of the lies he had told closed about him, had been pulling the muscles of his body tighter and tighter. Until now, he could not remember the time when he had not been dreading something. Even when he was a little boy, it was always there, behind him or before, or on either side. There had always been the shadowed corner, the dark place into which he dared not look, but from which something seemed always to be watching him. And Paul had done things that were not pretty to watch, he knew. But now he had a curious sense of relief, as though he had at last thrown down the gauntlet to the thing in the corner. Yet it was but a day since he had been sulking in the traces, but yesterday afternoon that he had been sent to the bank with Denny and Carson's deposits, as usual. But this time he was instructed to leave the book to be balanced. There were above $2,000 in checks and nearly 1,000 in banknotes, which he had taken from the book and quietly transferred to his pockets. At the bank, he had made out a new deposit slip. His nerves had been steady enough to permit of his returning to the office, where he had finished his work and asked for a full day's holiday tomorrow, Saturday, giving a perfectly reasonable pretext. The bank book, he knew, would not be returned before Monday or Tuesday, and his father would be out of town for the next week. From the time he slipped the banknotes into his pocket until he boarded the night train for New York, He had not known a moment's hesitation. It was not the first time Paul had steered through treacherous waters. How astonishingly easy it had all been. Here he was, the thing done, and this time there would be no awakening, no figure at the top of the stairs. He watched the snowflakes whirling by his window until he fell asleep. When he awoke, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He bounded up with a start. Half of one of his precious days gone already. He spent more than an hour in dressing, watching every stage of his toilet carefully in the mirror. Everything was quite perfect. He was exactly the kind of boy he had always wanted to be. When he went downstairs, Paul took a carriage and drove up Fifth Avenue toward the park. The snow had somewhat abated. Carriages and tradesmen's wagons were hurrying to and fro in the winter twilight. Boys in woolen mufflers were shoveling off the doorsteps. The avenue stages made fine spots of color against the white street. Here and there on the corners were stands with whole flower gardens blooming under glass cases, against the sides of which the snowflakes stuck and melted. Violets, roses, carnations, lilies of the valley, somehow vastly more lovely and alluring that they blossomed thus unnaturally in the snow. The park itself was a wonderful stage winterpiece. When he returned, the pause of the twilight had ceased, and the tune of the streets had changed. The snow was falling faster. Lights streamed from the hotels that reared their dozen stories fearlessly up into the storm, defying the raging Atlantic winds. A long black stream of carriages poured down the avenue, intersected here and there by other streams tending horizontally. There were a score of cabs about the entrance of his hotel, and his driver had to wait. Boys in livery were running in and out of the awning that was stretched across the sidewalk, up and down the red velvet carpet laid from the door to the street. Above, about, within it all was the rumble and roar, the hurry and toss of thousands of human beings, as hot for pleasure as himself, and on every side of him towered the glaring affirmation of the omnipotence of wealth. The boy set his teeth and drew his shoulders together in a spasm of realization. The plot of all dramas, the texts of all romances, the nerve stuff of all sensations was whirling about him like the snowflakes. He burnt like a faggot in a tempest. When Paul went down to dinner, the music of the orchestra came floating up the elevator shaft to greet him. His head whirled as he stepped into the thronged corridor, and he sank back into one of the chairs against the wall to get his breath. The lights, the chatter, the perfumes, the bewildering medley of color, he had for a moment the feeling of not being able to stand it. But only for a moment. These were his own people, he told himself. He went slowly about the corridors, through the writing rooms, the smoking rooms, reception rooms, as though he were exploring the chambers of an enchanted palace, built and peopled for him alone. When he reached the dining room, he sat down at a table near a window. The flowers, the white linen, the many-colored wine glasses, the gay toilets of the women, the low popping of corks, the undulating repetitions of the Blue Danube from the orchestra, all flooded Paul's dream with bewildering radiance. When the rosy tinge of his champagne was added, that cold, precious, bubbling stuff that creamed and foamed in his glass, Paul wondered that there were honest men in the world at all. This was what all the world was fighting for, he reflected. This was what all the struggle was about. He doubted the reality of his past. Had he ever known a place called Cordelia Street? A place where fagged-looking businessmen got on the early car? Mere rivets in a machine, they seemed to Paul. Sickening men, with combings of children's hair always hanging to their coats, and the smell of cooking in their clothes. Cordelia Street. Ah, that belonged to another time and country. Had he not always been thus? Had he not sat here night after night, from as far back as he could remember, looking pensively over just such shimmering textures and slowly twirling the stem of a glass, like this one, between his thumb and middle finger? He rather thought he had. He was not in the least abashed or lonely. He had no especial desire to meet or to know any of these people. All he demanded was the right to look on and conjecture, to watch the pageant. The mere stage properties were all he contended for. Nor was he lonely later in the evening, in his loge at the Metropolitan. He was now entirely rid of his nervous misgivings, of his forced aggressiveness, of the imperative desire to show himself different from his surroundings. He felt now that his surroundings explained him. Nobody questioned the purple. He had only to wear it passively. He had only to glance down at his attire to reassure himself that here it would be impossible for anyone to humiliate him. He found it hard to leave his beautiful sitting room to go to bed that night, and sat long watching the raging storm from his turret window. When he went to sleep, it was with the lights turned on in his bedroom, partly because of his old timidity, and partly so that if he should wake in the night, there would be no wretched moment of doubt, no horrible suspicion of yellow wallpaper or of Washington and Calvin above his bed. Sunday morning, the city was practically snowbound. Paul breakfasted late, and in the afternoon he fell in with a wild San Francisco boy, a freshman at Yale, who said he had run down for a little flyer over Sunday. The young man offered to show Paul the night side of the town, and the two boys went out together after dinner, not returning to the hotel until 7 o'clock the next morning. They had started out in the confiding warmth of a champagne friendship, but their parting in the elevator was singularly cool. The freshman pulled himself together to make his train, and Paul went to bed. He awoke at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, very thirsty and dizzy, and rang for ice water, coffee, and the Pittsburgh papers. On the part of the hotel management, Paul excited no suspicion. There was this to be said for him, that he wore his spoils with dignity, and in no way made himself conspicuous. Even under the gloss of his wine, he was never boisterous, though he found the stuff like a magician's wand for wonder building. His chief greediness lay in his ears and eyes, and his excesses were not offensive ones. His dearest pleasures were the gray winter twilights in his sitting room, his quiet enjoyment of his flowers, his clothes, his wide divan, his cigarette, and his sense of power. He could not remember a time when he had felt so at peace with himself. The mere release from the necessity of petty lying every day, and every day restored his self-respect. He had never lied for pleasure, even at school, but to be noticed and admired, to assert his difference from the other Cordelia Street boys, and he felt a good deal more manly, more honest even, now that he had no need for boastful pretensions, now that he could, as his actor friends used to say, dress the part. It was characteristic that remorse did not occur to him. His golden days went by without a shadow, and he made each as perfect as he could. On the 8th day after his arrival in New York, he found the whole affair exploited in the Pittsburgh papers, exploited with a wealth of detail which indicated that local news of a sensational nature was at low ebb. The firm of Denny and Carson announced that the boy's father had refunded the full amount of the theft and that they had no intention of prosecuting. The Cumberland minister had been interviewed and expressed his hope of yet reclaiming the motherless boy, and his Sabbath school teacher declared that she would spare no effort to that end. The rumor had reached Pittsburgh that the boy had been seen in a New York hotel, and his father had gone east to find him and bring him home. Paul had just come in to dress for dinner. He sank into a chair, weak to the knees, and clasped his head in his hands. It was to be worse than jail even. The tepid waters of Cordelia Street were to close over him finally and forever. The gray monotony stretched before him in hopeless, unrelieved years. Sabbath school, young people's meeting, the yellow-papered room, the damp dish towels, it all rushed back upon him with a sickening vividness. He had the old feeling that the orchestra had suddenly stopped, the sinking sensation that the play was over. The sweat broke out on his face, and he sprang to his feet, looked about him with his white, conscious smile, and winked at himself in the mirror. With something of the old childish belief in miracles, with which he had so often gone to class, all his lessons unlearned, Paul dressed and dashed, whistling down the corridor to the elevator. He had no sooner entered the dining room and caught the measure of the music than his remembrance was lightened by his old elastic power of claiming the moment, mounting with it, and finding it all sufficient. The glare and glitter about him, the mere scenic accessories had again, and for the last time, their old potency. He would show himself that he was game. He would finish the thing splendidly. He doubted more than ever the existence of Cordelia Street, and for the first time he drank his wine recklessly. Was he not, after all, one of those fortunate beings born to the purple? Was he not still himself, and in his own place? He drummed a nervous accompaniment to the Pagliacci music and looked about him, telling himself over and over that it had paid. He reflected drowsily, to the swell of the music and the chill sweetness of his wine, that he might have done it more wisely. He might have caught an outbound steamer and been well out of their clutches before now. But the other side of the world had seemed too far away and too uncertain then. He could not have waited for it. His need had been too sharp. If he had to choose over again, he would do it again, the same thing tomorrow. He looked affectionately about the dining room, now gilded with a soft mist. Ah, it had paid indeed. Paul was awakened next morning by a painful throbbing in his head and feet. He had thrown himself across the bed without undressing, and had slept with his shoes on. His limbs and hands were lead-heavy, and his tongue and throat were parched and burnt. There came upon him one of those fateful attacks of clear-headedness that never occurred except when he was physically exhausted and his nerves hung loose. He lay still and closed his eyes and let the tide of things wash over him. His father was in New York, stopping at some joint or other, he told himself. The memory of successive summers on the front stoop fell upon him like a weight of black water. He had not $100 left, and he knew now, more than ever, that money was everything, the wall that stood between all he loathed and all he wanted. The thing was winding itself up. He had thought of that on his first glorious day in New York, and had even provided a way to snap the thread. It lay on his dressing table now. He had got it out last night when he came blindly up from dinner, but the shiny metal hurt his eyes, and he disliked the looks of the thing. He rose and moved about with a painful effort, succumbing now and then to attacks of nausea. It was the old depression exaggerated. All the world had become Cordelia Street. Yet somehow he was not afraid of anything, was absolutely calm, perhaps because he had looked into the dark corner at last and knew. It was bad enough what he saw there, but somehow not so bad as his long fear of it had been. He saw everything clearly now. He had a feeling that he had made the best of it, that he had lived the sort of life he was meant to live, and for half an hour he sat staring at the revolver. But he told himself that was not the way, so he went downstairs and took a cab to the ferry. When Paul arrived at Newark, he got off the train and took another cab, directing the driver to follow the Pennsylvania tracks out of the town. The snow lay heavy on the roadways and had drifted deep into the open fields. Only here and there the dead grass or dried weed stalks projected, singularly black above it. Once well into the country, Paul dismissed the carriage and walked, floundering along the tracks, his mind a medley of irrelevant things. He seemed to hold in his brain an actual picture of everything he had seen that morning. He remembered every feature of both his drivers, of the toothless old woman from whom he had bought the red flowers in his coat, the agent from whom he had got his ticket, and all of his fellow passengers on the ferry. His mind, unable to cope with the vital matters near at hand, worked feverishly and deftly at sorting and grouping these images. They made for him a part of the ugliness of the world, of the ache in his head, and the bitter burning on his tongue. He stooped and put a handful of snow into his mouth as he walked, but that too seemed hot. When he reached a little hillside, where the tracks ran through a cut some 20 feet below, he stopped and sat down. The carnations in his coat were drooping with the cold, he noticed, their red glory all over. It occurred to him that all the flowers he had seen in the glass cases that first night must have gone the same way, long before this. It was only one splendid breath they had, in spite of their brave mockery at the winter outside the glass, and it was a losing game in the end, it seemed, this revolt against the homilies by which the world is run. Paul took one of the blossoms carefully from his coat and scooped a little hole in the snow where he covered it up. Then he dozed a while, from his weak condition, seemingly insensible to the cold. The sound of an approaching train awoke him, and he started to his feet, remembering only his resolution and afraid lest he should be too late. He stood, watching the approaching locomotive, his teeth chattering, his lips drawn away from them in a frightened smile. Once or twice he glanced nervously sideways, as though he were being watched. When the right moment came, he jumped. As he fell, the folly of his haste occurred to him with merciless clearness, the vastness of what he had left undone. There flashed through his brain, clearer than ever before, the blue of Adriatic water, the yellow of Algerian sands. He felt something strike his chest, and that his body was being thrown swiftly through the air, on, immeasurably far and fast, while his limbs were gently relaxed. Then, because the picture-making mechanism was crushed, the disturbing visions flashed into black, and Paul dropped back into the immense design of things. The end. So that's the end of our story. Not a very happy one, but we see how his mind worked and how his dream for that other life, just like the red carnations that he put in his coat and eventually noticed were dying and wilting, didn't last. It didn't last for long. I hope you enjoyed this story, and I'll read for you another time. Goodbye.